my name is Arpita, and I will be taking international relations here at Vishnu IAS for your foundation batch. So, guys, today's agenda is that I have picked up around 6 topics for discussion. However, one topic I'm going to give particular emphasis to, that is the Afghanistan and the whole Taliban situation. So I'm going to be spending a little more time on helping you guys understand the Afghanistan and the Taliban scenario. And after that, there are a couple of more 5 topics that we will discuss in one or two of them we will discuss in little more detail, and some of them are very factual, so that I will discuss briefly. So that will be the agenda for our discussion today. And with respect to this Taliban and Afghanistan issue, I'm sure all of you are already reading about it. Now, one problem with analyzing something like the Afghanistan issue is that it is unfolding so fast that any analysis cannot match up with the ground reality. And although what I'll try to do for you all today is give you all more of a background of the situation, so that no matter what you read and what unfolds in the coming weeks, at least that background we have in mind. And let's see what happens maybe in the coming 2-3 weeks, and after that I can release another video for you all. So this is broadly the agenda for today. So why in news, as the Taliban is making a lot of territorial gains in Afghanistan, that is basically the context because of which this issue is in news. And these are some newspaper clippings, that I've taken, that Taliban gains complicating India's option. Why it is complicating India's option is something that we will see. India joining other nations. Many of the nations are now saying that if Taliban takes over Kabul and takes over the government by force, we are not going to recognize such a government. So this is also one of the things in news. And what are going to be the ramifications for India? So this is, of course, still an unfolding situation. So let me help you put this entire thing in perspective. Now, see, one of the things I will caution you is that at least for the next 1.5 months, some of the other development is going to continue to come with respect to Afghanistan. As the Taliban will, take up more provincial capitals, we are going to see a lot more things in news. I'm going to give you a background and a context today to understand this whole situation. Now, you do not have to sit every day making notes from newspapers based on, okay, today Afghanistan captured Ghazni, tomorrow it captured Kandahar. Not like that. That is not what we need to do for this exam. We need to see things from a broader perspective, and also in terms of how it affects India's interest. In addition to that, if anything more drastic happens in the coming days, we will take that up. Clear? Okay. So before I even begin discussing the issue, let me show you this map. Now, what I want you to see, first come to this map, okay? This map that you see here. Notice the countries that are sharing borders with Afghanistan. Does India share a border with Afghanistan? Well, officially, we do share a border, but that is now part of the, yes, as Yashwant pointed out, it's part of the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So not in terms of reality, but yes, according to our maps, we do share a border. Does Afghanistan have border with China? You can already see that here. Yes. Now this border with China, it's actually a very narrow border, somewhat I think around 70-kilometer border. And this is known as the Wakhan corridor. It is a natural reserve on either side called the Wakhan corridor. And notice there are total 6 countries, if we leave out India for now, that are sharing borders with Afghanistan. So you have Iran here, Turkmenistan here, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, China, and Pakistan. These are the 6 countries that are sharing borders with Afghanistan. Now I'll show you the next map that even Sir had shared in your Telegram channel of the areas that are currently under Taliban's control. See, the red areas are under Taliban's control and the green ones are under government control. For now, let's focus on the red and the blue part, because the yellow ones, because BBC is being an international news organization, has calling them contested. No one knows exactly the ground reality because there are contesting claims of both the government and the Taliban. But let's focus on the red areas for now. Who has control over this Wakhan corridor that I showed you just now, where the border is shared with China? Look at the map and tell me. This region. Taliban, exactly, Taliban. Now see, again, if you look at where the border is there with Turkmenistan, compare both the maps. This the border which they share with Afghanistan and with Iran, most of the area, who is having control? This region, if you can see, this part, again coming under Taliban. So one thing that we have to notice here is that Taliban has very strategically controlled these provinces that are along the border areas. Why is it important? Why is the control of these border areas important? The border that Afghanistan is sharing with other countries? Whatever, you can tell me, you can even make a guess here. Well, far from Kabul. Yeah, actually, Jay is making a good point. See, once you are controlling these border areas, getting foreign military help is going to be difficult. One is that. Second is that right now, from whatever we are reading, it is becoming quite clear that the government forces are in a retreat and it is the Taliban that is having an upper hand. Now, if the government even wants to get back some of this control, probably it could have used some of these other countries to go there, and from there the military could have come in and attacked Taliban. But even that is not possible because the borders are now under Taliban control. Madana is also making Jaydev is also making an important point. Imports and export. See, if you're controlling the border areas, you can also suck the revenues of the government dry. And in turn, you can increase your own access to revenues and trade. So these are some of the reasons why control of these border areas becomes important, as you can see in the map. Now, in addition to this, there is one more thing that I would want to point out for you all. Is this aspect clear why the control of the border areas is important? Okay. Abhi, look at this map here, this map. Okay. Here you see Kabul, Ghazni and Kandahar. See, relatively in the southern part of the country, it seems like the government still is retaining some control compared to the northern part of the country, which is increasingly going under Taliban. But recently, if you have read, this Ghazni city has come under the control of Taliban. Now, why this becomes important is, and Kandahar also, if you have read, there are reports of Kandahar also having fallen under the control of Taliban. There is a highway between Kandahar to Kabul that runs through Ghazni. Because of that, Ghazni has some strategic importance. And that is why you will see today, at least till even half an hour back, some of the reports started reading that now Kabul is a matter of time. This is one of the reasons why control over Kabul for Taliban is a matter of time, because it has got control of this entire highway going from Kandahar to Kabul after getting control of Ghazni. Have you come across that Ghazni fell under Taliban control? I think it was a few days back. Okay, so this is the significance of Ghazni. Now, of course, there are more provinces of provincial capitals that are under Taliban control, but at least the border areas and this Ghazni I wanted to draw your attention to. Okay, I'll move on. So I want to give you all a brief history of Afghanistan and also of the Taliban, because that will help us put the present things in perspective. So I'm not going back to the the 1933 time period. I'm starting from 1973, when the monarchy is abolished and Afghanistan is established as a republic. So I'm starting from this 1973 period. Acha, by the way, in world history, this this 1973 to 1990s period that we will see in world history, what is this period popularly known as? Cold War. Yes, this is the time of the Cold War. So what is happening in 1973? If you can see this man here, this is Muhammad Dawood. He seizes power from the monarch in a coup. After that, he rules between 1973 to 78. But in 78, what happens is that there is a pro-Soviet coup and this man is removed. And in this pro-Soviet coup, General Dawood is removed. And in 1979, we have the Soviet army invading Afghanistan. Invading Afghanistan to keep the pro-communist government or the pro-Soviet government in power. And in 1980, what they do is, this man whom you see here, Barbak Karmal, he is made as the new president of Afghanistan. So now if the Soviets are going and invading in Afghanistan, what is America going to do, given that this is the Cold War period? Help Afghanistan. Okay. Help whom? Try to capture Afghanistan. Okay. So basically try to prevent this pro-Soviet government from being in power in Afghanistan. Not want to capture Afghanistan as such, but preventing a pro-Soviet government. So what they start doing is, US along with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Have you heard of the Mujahideen? Yes, prevent communism, right, Yashwant? So what America starts doing in this period, along with the help of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, is that they start giving money and arms to these Mujahideen groups. These Mujahideen groups come from within Afghanistan only, most of them, and they start giving money to these Mujahideen group. Now, Mujahideen groups themselves were not a very homogeneous group. There were a lot of differences between them also, but for the purpose of our understanding right now, we are saying that they start arming the Mujahideen groups. So this continues. The Soviet invasion that begins in 1978 continues till the year 1988. And what happens in 1988 is that Afghanistan, USSR, USA, they sign a peace accord, and Soviet Union says that, okay, I'm going to pull out my troops. The story clear till 1988? Okay. Now, there is a period of civil war from 92 to 96 precisely. There is a president called Najibullah who becomes the president, but of course in 92 he is assassinated by Taliban. So in 96, and Taliban was one of the Mujahideen groups only initially. Okay. In 96, the Taliban seizes control of Kabul. So something that, we are fearing is going to happen. Maybe in the next few weeks, a return of 1996. So they seize control of Kabul, and the Taliban is recognized as a legitimate ruler of Afghanistan by countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. From 1996 to 2001, Taliban's government, Taliban's rule is there in Afghanistan. In 2001, what happens? One of the most important events in our contemporary history. Come on, you must have watched so many Hollywood movies on this. Yes, Twin Tower attack. 9/11 happens in 2001. And after 9/11 happens, although Taliban, many analysts would say that is a Frankenstein's monster created by USA itself because they armed the Mujahideen at one point. But USA decided that, okay, we'll have to remove this Taliban government from power because they are giving a safe haven for terrorists. So US attack begins in Afghanistan after 9/11. Taliban, of course, loses initially in the US attack, and in 2005, the first parliamentary elections happen in Afghanistan after a period of 30 years. So from 2005 to 2015, you have a relatively peaceful period in the sense that there is some form of government legitimacy in Afghanistan. But 2015 is when you see the beginning of this Taliban offensive. So what you are seeing now in 2021 actually had begun in 2015 itself. Okay. Is the picture clear so far? I don't know how many of you knew about this chronology already, but I thought that, I should tell it once so that we can understand the sequence of events in Afghanistan. So have any of you read this book or watched this movie, The Kite Runner? Seen in Forbes News. You had seen the timeline in Forbes News or about the Kite Runner? You're saying, Yashwant, I didn't get you. Okay, so this is a very famous novelist, okay, Khaled Hosseini. He's an Afghan novelist, and he has 3 books actually, or 4: The Kite Runner, Thousand Splendid Suns, and The Mountains Echoed. Beautiful books. If at any time you are bored of your preparation, these are novels. Do pick The Kite Runner and read. It describes, the whole sequence of events that I just told you in the form of a timeline that is weaved into a beautiful novel and a beautiful story. So if not the movie, if not the book, do try watching the movie at some point. Okay. Moving on. This is an interesting aspect, and I definitely want to tell you guys about this. What did India do when from 1996 to 2001 we had the Taliban rule in Afghanistan? What were we doing? What was our response at that time? Were we not doing anything? You can say that also. Any idea as to what India did during this Taliban rule in Afghanistan? Okay. So I'll tell you, and this is a nice story to keep in mind. So this man whom you see here, he is a person known as Ahmad Shah Massoud. You can go and Google a little bit more about him. Now, what happens is, see, Taliban, even during that 96 to 2001 period, Taliban does not enjoy the support of the entire Afghan society. So there were other groups that were opposing Taliban. And one of these groups came to be known as Northern Alliance. If you have been reading the Hindu carefully over the last, sorry, my pen is not working, so I'm using this today. Northern Alliance. If you have been reading Hindu over the last 1 year or so, you would have come across Northern Alliance at some point with respect to Taliban. This Northern Alliance fights a defensive war against Taliban during this 96 to 2001 period. And this person who you see here, this black and white picture, is a picture of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was the leader of the Northern Alliance. Now, this person, I don't think most of you would know about him. He is one of India's former ambassadors. His name is Ambassador Bharat Rajmuthu Kumar. Now, why am I telling you about him? what India does during this period of Taliban rule is that, do you see what is written here? How India secretly armed Afghanistan's northern alliance. So this is a report from the Hindu, where one of the Hindu journalists interviewed this former ambassador, and it's very interesting. We do not know much about this in India. Had it been a Western country or America, by now they would have made a movie about this person, this former ambassador. That India secretly actually helped this Northern Alliance fight against the Taliban. How did we help? Not in terms of providing any large scale equipment, but India provided some small armaments. India provided food, medicine. India helped the Northern Alliance maintain their helicopters. Any of the Northern Alliance fighters who were severely injured in fighting against Taliban were brought to Delhi for treatment. And Northern Alliance, by the way, was not operating from within Afghanistan. That was not possible under Taliban rule. Can you guess from where Northern Alliance could have been operating? I have already showed you the map. Make a guess. It is one of those 6 countries with whom Afghanistan shares border. Okay, they were operating out of China today. They were operating from Tajikistan. They had their base in Dushanbe. So, and this, one of the things that, if you are again, I would suggest you to watch something after I have finished explaining Taliban to you. You will hear this Northern Alliance reference more and more now, as to whether India should try establishing contact with some of the remaining lead. Now, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the person in the black and white picture, he was assassinated in 2001. If there are any of these remaining leaders of the Northern Alliance, now that it almost seems inevitable that Taliban will either form a government itself or will be a part of some kind of power sharing agreement, India should revive contacts with some of the older Northern Alliance leaders. So it is in that context I brought this issue up of the Northern Alliance. Is it clear? Hello? Sleeping, awake? Okay. Okay, so keep this thing in mind whenever, and this is something that you're definitely going to come across in the next few days as you will watch any TV debates. Okay. Now, coming to the more present day scenario, now that I have given you some background, Abhi, what we are reading is US has decided ki okay, Tata bye bye. You deal with your problem. I am going to withdraw my troops. So now that US is going to withdraw its troops, we need to understand as to what it means for the different regional players. So most important player to is going to be Taliban. Now, Taliban ke liye also the situation is not very simple. Okay, Taliban does not enjoy extensive support throughout the country. Actually, it enjoys more support in the countryside than in the cities. And as an insurgent group, when you do not enjoy a lot of support, but if you forcefully come to power, what is going to happen? There is going to be some other group that will try to oppose you, like it happened with the Northern Alliance. And that creates a situation of a civil war. So, one is that even if Taliban, if it does not accommodate the interests of all sections of Afghan society, this condition of a civil war is going to arise. Now, another is our good old friend China. So, what do you think China's opinion will be of the Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan? Will China like a strong Taliban in Afghanistan? Complicated, because yes, you're right. the Uyghur issue will become a pinpoint for China, because the border, even though it's a small border, the border that is being shared, that region is the Xinjiang province, where China has the Uyghur issue. So China, although it is definitely engaging with Taliban leaders, and Taliban leaders have actually, gone ahead and said that we will welcome Chinese investments in the country, but China is also apprehensive of a very strong Taliban in Afghanistan, because one is of that Uyghur issue. Another is that, although the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is the BRI passing through Afghanistan, the BRI route? Does the BRI route pass through Afghanistan? Okay, it does not pass exactly through Afghanistan, but it touches along the border areas of Afghanistan. Okay, where you saw that the Taliban is in control. So one is, China would also be apprehensive of the infrastructure investment that it is making in the BRI, in these border areas particularly. So this is with respect to China. But of course, China, compared to India, has been relatively more accommodative of Taliban, and have already initiating talks with Taliban and visiting Taliban leaders, visiting China and all of that. And yes, one thing that is becoming clear to China now is that US power is declining. So the troops withdrawal from Afghanistan is also going to provide China some kind of an opportunity, like it has done with case of Iran. The moment US withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, China was like, it's okay, I'm going to help you. So this can also be an opportunity for China. The weakening of US and the NATO control over Afghanistan. Now coming to India. So about India, you guys tell me, what was going to be the impact of US withdrawal for India? See, one is that although Pakistan does not officially acknowledge this, but Taliban enjoys the support of the ISI, right? Taliban, I mean, almost like when during the 1996 to 2001 period, when Taliban was in control of Afghanistan, it had almost become like Pakistan's backyard because of the control that the ISI has over it. So this anti-India terrorist activities being done through Afghanistan is a concern for India. Second is, over the years, we have made a lot of investments also in Afghanistan, and I'll show you some of the examples shortly. So protecting our investments there, already if you have seen, India has asked all its nationals who are in Afghanistan to take in the commercial flights available and return back to the country. And in fact, the recent killing of the photojournalist Danish Siddiqui, I'm sure you have read about it. So being Indian only right now under a Taliban rule is going to be problematic. And so this is one thing. Also, if Taliban comes to power in Pakistan, it can play directly into the hands of Taliban comes to power in Afghanistan, it will directly play into the hands of Pakistan. Yes, diaspora of Afghanistan people in India and these anti-India groups. So this is India's scenario. Now, even with respect to Pakistan, Pakistan definitely enjoys leverage with Taliban, but there are some problem areas for Pakistan also with respect to Afghanistan. Yeah, there are many Afghani students who study in India, correct? Have you heard of this group in Pakistan, Tehreek-e-Taliban, TTP? Yeah, so TTP basically is an anti-Pakistani state group. And the TTP is located along these border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So if Afghanistan, goes into a civil war, and if the situation in Afghanistan becomes unstable, then groups like the TTP will find it very easy to get sanctuary in Afghanistan. And also, a civil war in Afghanistan can create a situation of even a refugee issue for Pakistan. So it's not a very, bright and sunny scenario for Pakistan as well. And for Iran, now Iran, of course, Taliban's ideology is based on Sunni extremism, and Iran is a Shia country, is basically a Shia dominant country. So oppression of Shia groups by Taliban is an issue for Iran. So these are the different regional actors whose brief I have given you as to how they are going to be impacted with the US withdrawal. Is it clear? Okay. Finding things interesting so far? ठीक है. Now to quickly see, this is a very good infographics that actually appeared in Times of India, and you can actually use something like this even while writing your answers. It shows what kind of partnership India has with Afghanistan. So all the investments that we have made in Afghanistan, like in terms of infrastructure, we have this Jaranj to Delaram highway. And Acha, by the way, this Jaranj province, this is located along the border area of Afghanistan and Iran. And even that has come under Taliban control now. So you can imagine the kind of threat that Indian investments are going to be in Afghanistan. Then the connectivity projects, the different in capacity building, we have basically been providing training to the Afghan armed forces. One thing you should know about India's policy with respect to Afghanistan is that we have a no boots on the ground policy. No boots on the ground is like, unlike America, we do not send our soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan. How we support the Afghan army is by providing them capacity building, or at times also providing them helicopters, but we do not send our own troops to Afghanistan. Economic development, humanitarian assistance, and this building of the hospital and all of this. So you can read about this. I will share these slides with you all. So these are the 5 pillars on which India's Afghanistan policy has been based. Now coming to the peace process, which has become very important. So when it comes to the peace process, there are, like, I have noted down here 5 different peace initiatives that have been ongoing. Most important among them is definitely this Doha peace process, or the Doha agreement. So who is the main party in the Doha agreement? So Doha is mainly between, yes, US and Taliban. Now there are some, I have noted down briefly here what are the different aspects of the Doha agreement. There are 2 parts to the Doha agreement. One is related to the US troops withdrawal and a prisoner swap between the government of Afghanistan and Taliban. Basically, Taliban releasing the kidnapped officials, and in return, the government releasing some Taliban fighters. Some sanctions that the US should remove on Taliban leaders. So one is this aspect, and the other is the intra-Afghan peace negotiation. Intra-Afghan peace negotiation is between the intra-Afghan negotiations are between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Okay. Yes, correct. Taliban and the Afghan government. So problem is nothing concrete has come out of the intra-Afghan peace negotiation, and even the power sharing is not finalized. If you were reading, yesterday or day before yesterday, Taliban said that, well, we have not received any power sharing proposal from the government, and the government is saying that we have made a power sharing proposal to the Taliban. And one of the things that was being said is that through this Doha peace process and the intra-Afghan peace negotiation, what Taliban was basically trying to do is buy time so that the US forces will withdraw. And the moment the US troops withdraw, they are going to take over the country, which is what seems to be happening now. And if you look at the, as to whether Taliban has abided by any of the aspects of the Doha peace agreement, then they have just followed one principle, that they have not attacked the US troops or the US bases in Afghanistan so far. That is the only part of the agreement that they have adhered to. Otherwise, ceasefire, so they will stop fighting for 3-4 days, again resume. So the rest of it has more or less, particularly this intra-Afghan peace negotiation, has mostly not been successful. In addition to this, you have some more initiatives like this Heart of Asia. Heart of Asia is led by Turkey. This happens in Istanbul. And it talks about something called double peace. Double peace is that we need stability and peace not only within Afghanistan, but also in the surrounding areas of Afghanistan. That is the idea of double peace. So, by the way, did India participate in this? Was India invited to any of these Doha peace agreement meetings? So we haven't. We only attended one at with one of these intra-Afghan peace negotiation. We attended in 2020 through video conference. As an observer in official capacity. Otherwise, I'll just tell you what our stand on the peace process is. So in this Heart of Asia, though, India participates, but Heart of Asia is not a very impactful peace negotiation process. And there are many countries in Heart of Asia. No need to memorize them. There are some 17 countries. Then we have the Moscow format. Moscow format is like providing an alternative to the US-led format. So this here you have Russia, Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, Iran, and India. In the Moscow format, India engaged in a non-official level. Non-official level meaning that because it was for talking to Taliban, we sent some of our old ambassadors to participate, and it was at a non-official level. Then you have this Troika. I think you would have come across some of these news saying that India not invited to extended Troika. Troika is 3 countries, Russia, USA, and China. And nowadays, the extended Troika that you see, what they have done is they have included Pakistan as well. And then you have this 6+2+1 talk. 6+2+1 is, can you guess who these 6 nations are? It's written here though. The 6 nations who are bordering Afghanistan. Those 6 countries, +2 is your US and Russia. And this 6+2+1 is under the aegis of the United Nations. So these are the few attempts at the peace process. Now coming to India, is India in favor of talking to Taliban? No. So our stand has been that we want an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned and Afghan-controlled peace process, which basically means that the government which we say has been democratically elected, that has to be the important aspect of the peace process and not Taliban. And it has to be an inclusive peace process. So far we have not engaged with Taliban, except at some non-official level, like I showed you in the Moscow format. But this has also had some problems for us. What do you think has happened because of our reluctance to engage with Taliban? Okay, so the problem that has been created is that India has not been included in most of these peace process talks. We have been sidelined. Now, why have we been sidelined? Definitely because we do not have any influence with the Taliban. We have politically isolated ourselves by deciding to not to talk to Taliban. The problem is that there was nothing wrong with our policy of engaging with an elected government, and our policy that we are going to stand by the elected government. India had good relations with the government in Afghanistan, but the problem is that we failed to respond to the changing ground reality. शुरू में ठीक था, but once the Taliban started gaining ground, that's when we lost out on an opportunity of engaging with Taliban. And it is not like there are some sections of Taliban who have actually not been very opposed to India. They have actually said that, well, in the future of Afghanistan, India, because it has made so many investments, will actually have an important role to play. And even when Article 370 was abrogated, some of the Taliban leaders, unlike, say, Pakistan or China, who went ahead and criticized us in UN, some of the Taliban leaders actually said that, well, this is an internal matter to India. Kashmir is an internal matter to India. So some sections of the Taliban were actually expressing willingness, but we did not capitalize on that opportunity. So we lost out on that opportunity of engaging with Taliban. So apprehension that engaging with Taliban would damage relations with the Afghan government. Now, one of the foreign ministers of Russia was asked as to why India has not been called in the extended troika, where Pakistan has been extended an invitation. So he said that, well, we see a role for India in the post-conflict situation, but we do not see a role for India in resolving this conflict because India does not have any leverage. This is what he said. So this has become like, other countries are not seeing a role for India right now. And definitely, why do you think that Pakistan will be a better strategic ally than India when it comes to Afghanistan? Why is Pakistan a better strategic ally? Everyone wants to engage Pakistan. US is engaging Pakistan. Russia wants to engage with Pakistan. Why is Pakistan a better strategic ally? More border, okay. This was also one of the arguments given, by the way, for not including India in that 6+2+1 that I showed you. There, India was not included because it was said that India actually does not share a border with Pakistan, with Afghanistan. Yes. So one is that Pakistan is a better strategic ally. One, because of the influence that it has over the Taliban. Second, definitely with respect to the border areas. If tomorrow another series of foreign attacks has to be launched in Afghanistan, then countries are going to have their military bases in Pakistan and not in India, right? So this is why actually Pakistan makes a better strategic ally than India. Is it clear why we did not find a good role for ourselves in the peace process? Okay. So now coming to one last aspect, okay, what options do we have now? So one of the things is that engaging with Taliban, at least those sections of within the Taliban also there are many divisions. So at least engaging with those sections of the Taliban who do not seem belligerent towards India. And in September 2020 we participated in the intra-Afghan peace talk in Doha via video conference. I already told you. And another thing is, whenever, and this is one suggestion for you, whenever you are writing about any kind of policy option in an exam, you can always divide it into short term and long term goal. Any policy option can have a short term goal and a long term goal. अभी हमारा short term goal क्या है? Short term goal is that we have to ensure the safety and security of those Indians who are there in Afghanistan, getting them out of the country safely, and protecting the investments that we have made in Afghanistan, like the Salma Dam that we have built, or that the Jaranj Delaram highway that we have made, or the hospitals that we have made, protecting those investments. Long-term goal is that we have to increase our diplomatic engagement and our diplomatic ability so that we can find a place on the table of the Afghan peace negotiations. Another party who, along with India, will not be very happy with a strong Taliban in Afghanistan is going to be Iran. So engaging with Iran. Also, Russian support. Russia has, over the years cultivated good links with the Taliban, and overall, Russia has always remained mindful of India's interest. So India would need Russia's support for any kind of direct engagement with Taliban. These are some of the policy options that I have listed for you. Now, as I said, this is an evolving situation. Let's see what happens in the coming 2 or 3 weeks, and then we can do one more session regarding this. So, is the Afghan picture clear to you guys in somewhat now? Now, UN is not playing a very active role side. As I told you, UN has started that one process of its own, that 6+2+1. Other than that, yes, some resolutions and all are being passed and being said that if a government comes forcefully in Afghanistan, we will not accept it. Other than that, UN does not have any any active role at present. Okay, clear so far? So this was the main discussion regarding Afghanistan and Taliban that I wanted to have. Now we will move to some other topics that were in news, and those we will go over quickly. Do you have another class that begins at 5 p.m.? Okay, fine then. So another thing that was in news is this UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of Sea. Why was it in news? It was in news because right now that we are a non-permanent member of the UNSC. India became a non-permanent member of the UNSC. Yes. So as a non-permanent member of the UNSC, we did this open debate in the UNSC with respect to enhancement of maritime security. Okay. Have you already discussed this UNCLOS thing? So, okay. So within this, now what happened that within this debate that we did on maritime security, we stressed the importance of the UNCLOS. So that is why it was in news. Now, before I tell you the specific provisions of the UNCLOS, I want to spend a little bit of time understanding the importance of maritime security for us. Okay. So why does maritime security matter to India? See, one reason why it matters to India is the fact that we have a very long coastline. What is the approximate length of our coastline? It's around 7,500 kilometers. One more thing, this topic of maritime, approximately 7,000, 7,500. This topic of maritime security is important not just for IR, but also for your internal security aspect that is part of your paper 3. So one is that this is why maritime security matters to us. We have a very long coastline. Another reason why maritime security matters to us is if you read this statement here, Indian armed forces are determined to cement India's reputation as a net security provider. I'm sure you have come across this term net security provider many times with respect to India's role in the Indian Ocean. But let's understand what is meant by this net security provider. Otherwise, it's just a term that we hear about. Generally, when we say that a country is a net security provider, we divide it into 4 aspects. One is the aspect of capacity building. So in capacity building, what we do, like some form of coastal surveillance is a part of capacity building. We provide training to the naval forces of other countries. That is capacity building. So one is capacity building. Second aspect of being a net security provider is military diplomacy. Military diplomacy will mean that we have many of these joint military exercises with other countries. So that's a part of military diplomacy. Then military assistance. Military assistance would be, many a times India gives these offshore patrol vehicles to other countries. So that's military assistance. And another aspect we have is direct deployment of military forces. Now, India has naval bases across the Indian Ocean region in many places. Although we do not directly deploy troops as much, but we use these naval bases more for information sharing and for surveillance. And one very important aspect of India's being a net security provider, do not look at security only from a military perspective, but you see the Indian Ocean region is prone to many kinds of natural disaster. So as a net security provider, we also provide some humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Generally, you will see if there is any tsunami in the Indian Ocean region, then the Indian Navy is the first to respond. So that also comes under net security provider. Just seeing the word security, do not just link it directly to military. It has all these aspects. So one is this. This is also why maritime security matters to us. Another thing is that you know that the Indian Ocean region is very also important for international trade. So one of the data that I was reading about, it said that nearly 80% of the global trade in oil passes through this Indian Ocean region. So because of these things, the Indian Ocean region becomes important. Now, one more thing I want to show you here. Can you see this map here? You can see this Strait of Hormuz, Bab el Mandab, Strait of Malacca. So there are three important sea lanes of communication that are there in the Indian Ocean. Sea lanes of communication is through which a lot of trade happens, a lot of the ships pass, the commercial ships pass. Can you tell me which sea is present here? The place where I marked with red. Which sea is present? Red Sea. Yes, you're correct. So one important sea lane of communication is the Red Sea with the Indian Ocean that is connected by this Bab el Mandab. By the way, these very narrow points that you see, like the Bab el Mandab, the Strait of Hormuz, these are called choke points. Choke points are these very narrow shipping lanes, which are very important for global trade as well, but they're extremely narrow. So one important sea lane of communication is through this Bab el Mandab. The second important is the Strait of Hormuz. What is this region? What is this known as? Strait of Hormuz connects the Indian Ocean with dash. What is going to be the fill in the blanks for this? Yes, the Persian Gulf. So this is the second important sea lane of communication, connecting the Persian Gulf with the Indian Ocean through the Strait of Hormuz. The third one is your Strait of Malacca. Which are the two water bodies that are connected through the Strait of Malacca? Indian Ocean and yes, Pacific. So this is the third important sea lane of communication. So these are the three important sea lanes of communication through which a lot of international trade happens in the Indian Ocean. Now this thing, as one of you already mentioned, pirates. Now see, the Indian Ocean region has a lot of what we say as non-traditional security threats. Non-traditional security threats means threats not emerging out of the state actors like the army or the military of any country, but these are threats that are emerging from non-state actors. So one is this piracy problem. Another is the illegal drug trafficking. That is also a problem in the Indian Ocean. So these are the main 5 reasons because of which maritime security is very important for India and the Indian Ocean region. Okay. Now coming to your UNCLOS. So what is this United Nations Convention of the Law of Seas? Some factual information. When was it signed? 82. When did it become effective? 94. And it provides a legal framework for maritime and maritime activities. These divisions I'll just show you through a map. And one important thing that you should remember with respect to UNCLOS is that it has created these three bodies: International Tribunal for Law of Sea, this is the symbol, International Seabed Authority, and the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Now, to show you these 5 areas, I have marked it here. See, these are the divisions that are made with the help of the UNCLOS agreement. This thing that you see here, this is called as the baseline. There are some specific definitions mentioned in the UNCLOS agreement with respect to how the baseline is determined. If any of you are geography optional students, you will know better about this. So when you look at the baseline, see, this is the baseline. Now, the water that is on the landward side of this baseline, which is facing towards the land, that is called as the internal water. And the water that is facing towards the sea on the opposite side of the baseline, so till 12 nautical miles from there, that you call the territorial sea. Who has jurisdiction over the territorial sea, the state government or the central government? So will a coastal state like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka have control over the territorial waters? State? No, it's not the state government, it's the central government that has control over the territorial waters. So the territorial waters are going to be from your baseline to 12 nautical miles. Okay. Now, in the territorial water, ships of another country can only come in according to innocent passage. What is this innocent passage? Innocent passage means that suppose tomorrow an American ships comes in our territorial water. It can come provided it should not be a threat to our security. This is what is meant by innocent passage. You can allow any vessel, it need not only be a commercial vessel, you can even allow a military vessel to enter your territorial water as long as the country does not perceive it as a security threat. This is known as innocent passage that is there in the territorial water. Otherwise, the country has the right to prohibit. Now, from the baseline till 12 nautical mile, we had territorial water. From territorial water to another 12 nautical mile or 24 nautical miles from the baseline, you have what is known as the contiguous zone. No need to understand each and every aspect and the geographical aspect and what is allowed, what is not allowed in each of them. That much is not required for us. We just need to know one, this innocent passage thing, who has jurisdiction over the territorial waters. These are the things that we need to know. Exclusive economic zone extends to 1200 nautical miles. So what can a country do in its exclusive economic zone? So suppose in this part of the sea, there are some kind of minerals that are present. Okay. Suppose there is some mineral that is some natural gas has been found here. So India will have the right of exploration in this exclusive economic zone. That is still the 200 nautical miles. Beyond this 200 nautical mile is what we call the high sea. High sea matlab individual country will not have jurisdiction over it. So this becomes international waters. If you have seen any foreign movies, or I don't know if any Indian movies, sometimes, after doing some criminal activities, and if they get on board on a ship, they would want to enter the high sea, because once they enter the high seas, they are no longer under the jurisdiction of the country where they committed the crime. So yes, the international waters. So this is what we call as the high seas. There's a show also on Netflix, I think, called The High Sea. Now I will show you a question, try to answer it. It's related to the International Seabed Authority. Look at the first statement here. It is saying that the International Seabed Authority has been established under the provisions of the UNCLOS and has its headquarters in New York. Is this statement correct? First statement, is it correct? Okay. The first part of the statement we already saw, that it was established, that it has been established under the provisions of UNCLOS. But is the headquarter located in New York? No. Where is the headquarters, Sangram? The headquarters of the International Seabed Authority is in Jamaica, not in New York. So this statement becomes incorrect. International Seabed Authority regulates all mineral related activities in the international seabed beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Is the second statement correct? The second statement is actually correct, and it is in context of India. If you see, then this International Seabed Authority allowed India to carry out explorations of polymetallic nodules in the central Indian Ocean basis. It was given to India initially for some years, but then it was extended by another 5 years. So that is why this International Seabed Authority is relevant from India's perspective also. So one cannot be the answer. So two only, or B is going to be the answer. Okay. Are you all awake? Do you need a cup of coffee? ठीक है. So this was the second thing that was in news. Now the third issue that was in news was with respect to this bill to restore the state's right to specify the OBC group. I'm sure you all have come across this topic in news if you have been following the newspapers. So this one is known as the 127th Constitutional Amendment Bill, and it has been passed by both the houses, despite all the bills that presently the opposition is objecting to. This one was passed quite unanimously. So what is this bill providing? Short and simple, this bill will allow the states and the union territories to prepare their own list of socially and educationally backward classes. Now, very ironically, the government was required to pass this bill and make this amendment because of one bill that it had itself passed. That was the 102nd Constitutional Amendment Bill. So what happened was that this bill is seeking to restore the power of the states to identify OBCs that are socially and economically backward. Now, why was this? What necessitated the passing of this bill? It was this 102nd Constitutional Amendment. Can you tell me which body was established by the 102nd Constitutional Amendment? Yes, the NCBC. Now, what happened was that the Supreme Court, after the passing of the 102nd Constitution Amendment, interpreted this amendment by saying that now only the president, in consultation with the governor, can specify the socially and economically backward classes, and state governments cannot specify the socially and economically backward classes. So what the Supreme Court said, that once the president specifies these groups, after that, if any change has to be made, if any addition or deletion has to be made, it will be done by the parliament after the president's notification. And it was taking away the power of the states and the union territories of designating their own groups or communities as socially and educationally backward. So because of this, it necessitated that the government should pass this 127th Amendment Bill. And what is it providing for? That now the president is going to notify the socially and educationally backward classes for the central government, and the central list will be maintained by the central government, and the states and the union territories will now prepare their own list, and this list can differ from the central list. So this is all there was to this bill. Now again, one question, and I would like more of you to answer this time. This is related to the National Commission for Backward Classes. The 102nd Constitutional Amendment Act provides constitutional status to the NCBC. Correct or incorrect? First statement is correct. The commission consists of 7 members, including a chairperson, vice chairperson, and 3 other members appointed by the president. Correct or incorrect? No idea? Okay. This is not 7. I've just changed this number. It is 5. So this statement becomes incorrect. Third statement, NCBC has the power of civil court while trying a suit. Power of civil court means that, if you can call upon the bodies to provide any kind of evidence to you. So if if you are called tomorrow that, okay, come in front of the NCBC to give evidence like you would do in front of a court, you will have to do so. So that means it has the power of a civil court. So is this statement correct that it has the power of a civil court? 3 is correct. So 1 is correct and 3 is correct, 2 is incorrect. So A is going to be our answer here. Achha, one question. I said that the 127th Amendment Bill was a constitutional amendment bill. Since it was a constitutional amendment bill, what kind of a majority did it require? What kind of majority do constitutional amendment bills require? Special majority, meaning half of the total membership of the house plus 2/3 of the members present and voting. Does it also require the other condition, the other type of special majority, that means ratification by half the state legislature? Does this 127th Amendment Bill require ratification of state legislatures? No, this bill does not require the ratification of the state legislature. Okay. It only required that special majority of the parliament. Okay. Coming to the next thing that was in news is this Ujjwala scheme. So not much to teach here, in the sense that this Ujjwala scheme is actually not a very new scheme. This scheme was launched in 2016, but a 2.0 version of the scheme has been started. Basically, what the scheme aims to provide is providing gas connection for the poor. And if you go to any petrol pumps, you will particularly see banners of this Ujjwala scheme. So it provides free LPG connection to poor household. There are some features of it as to, any eligible household, they get a deposit free connection along with the financial assistance of 1600 rupees per connection. And these are some targets that were achieved by the scheme, not reading them out right now. Here, see, why the scheme was important is because earlier women were using these firewood for cooking, and they were cooking inside the confines of their home, and that had a lot of health impact and respiratory impact, for particularly for women and children who were staying in the house. So in that sense it was important. Also women, for cooking, they would also travel in longer distances for collection of firewood. So that was also an issue here. Now this picture, if you see here, I want to draw your attention to one aspect here. This I've taken from the ministry's website, but do you see this free LPG connection to BPL household, this point? Now, this is a slightly older infographic that is there in the website. Nowadays, it is not just the BPL household, but the scope has been expanded. Just a second. Expanded in the sense that now the connections are not just given to women of BPL household, but SC, ST women, women who are registered as part of the Annadata Yojana, Annapurna Annadata Yojana, or women living in these river islands, forest dwellers. So now the scope has been expanded. So if you are given a statement that, the Ujjwala scheme provides free LPG connection only to BPL household, keep in mind that it is going to be incorrect, because now there are some 7-8 categories that have been included. So this 2.0, actually, why this was in news in this 2.0 scheme, basically what the Prime Minister said was that now migrant workers can also get access to this Ujjwala scheme. They can also get these this LPG connection, and they will not have to provide any address proof for it. This is basically the small thing that was in news. So look at this question. Under Ujjwala 2, migrant workers would no longer have to provide address proof documents to get the gas connection. As I told you, this statement is correct. Now, migrant workers would only be required to submit a self-declaration of their residential address. This statement is also correct. The third one, now, along with this deposit-free LPG scheme, the government is providing a few more things. It is providing the first refill, and it is also providing a hot plate free of cost to the beneficiaries. So all these three statements are actually correct. All of these are part of the Ujjwala 2.0. So instead of including them in the slide, I have given them in the form of a question. So all of these three statements are correct. Basically, what you have to remember with respect to Ujjwala 2.0, providing to migrant workers LPG connection and self-declaration, no need to provide an address proof. That's all. Census is important here because due to the outbreak of COVID, the census 2021 has been postponed by the Union Home Ministry. Let me show you one question and we'll discuss more. Is the first statement correct that the census was first started by British Viceroy Lord Mayo in 1872? Any idea about the first statement? Okay, why is it incorrect? No, it is actually the statement is not. This statement is not incorrect. Uh, it was started by Viceroy Lord Mayo. The first census results were published in 1881. It is not incorrect, and that's an interesting point you are making. Why would they spend so much? Actually, the British had this thing about collecting data. So they collected data on all kinds of things, more than we collect data now. They used to collect data actually. So this statement is actually not incorrect. The responsibility of conducting the census rests with the Registrar General and Census Commissioner, which comes under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. Is this statement correct? Does this Census Commissioner come under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs? Then which ministry does it come under? No, Home Affairs. Okay, it comes under Home Affairs. Yes, Sai is correct. So this statement becomes incorrect. The census is a database containing the list of all usual residents of the country. Third statement, is it correct? Okay, so what I have done in the third statement is that I have given you a definition of the NPR. This is what the NPR will do, the National Population Register. That will be a database of all usual residents of the country. Census is a database of many things. There are many details that are collected as a part of the census. There are some 29 items that are collected in your census data. So it is not a database of just this. This actually describes the NPR. So only the first statement is correct here. But what this question is asking us is to identify the incorrect statement. So 2 is incorrect and 3 is also incorrect. So B is going to be our answer here, okay? Please know a little bit about the difference between the National Population Register and the census. Otherwise, statements like the third one will appear correct to you, okay? The last news item for today is this PM Daksh. So PM Daksh was already an existing scheme, but now what has been done is that a mobile app has been launched for this scheme. So that is why it is in news. This also I will show you with the help of an MCQ, very factual. So consider the following statements about PM Daksh. This is the full form, by the way, Pradhan Mantri Dakshata or Kushalta. Dakshata, although my Hindi is not very good, but I think it means ability, and Kushalta means skill. Sampan Hidgrahi Yojana has been launched by the Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship. Although I have not told you, but do you think the first statement is correct based on reading the full form of the scheme? Okay. Okay. See, we got trapped here. The first statement is incorrect because based on the full form of the scheme, it does appear that it will be by the Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, but this is by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. So the first statement is actually incorrect here. So now that I have showed it to you like this, I hope you will be able to better remember it, right? Now coming to the second statement, it is saying that under this, the targeted groups are provided with short-term training program, upskilling, reskilling, entrepreneurship, development, long-term program. What do you think about the second statement? Is it correct or incorrect? Yes, the second statement is actually correct. Very broad-based statement this is, so it's very unlikely that this will be incorrect. So this statement is correct. So 2 is going to be the answer here. Okay, guys. So that was all that I had for today. If you have any questions, you can ask me. And I hope that you enjoyed the session. I did enjoy interacting with you guys.